Let's hit it.
Let's do it.
We good?
Yep.
All right. We're here. Back in action. All three of us back in the studio.
Version 2.0.
Still have some more paint to do and a few things, but we're getting there.
It'll come around.
Yeah. We're episode number 30, which is kind of cool.
Right. Season
3-0.
2.
Season 2, episode 1, or what we're going to call it, right?
Yeah. I think that's the plan.
Yeah. So we got a pretty good amount of topics. I think, we can kind of roll through and, I think they're top of mind for a lot of people in the world right now on the cyber side, and with Russia, Ukraine, kind of, heightened cyber tension and a few breaches going on and some interesting, geopolitical kind of hacktivism things we've seen. So I don't know, is a story you guys want to kind of pick to roll through with?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of reports recently coming from the White House and CISA essentially about a potential or pending, so they suspect cyber attack against our critical infrastructure. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Might be a good place to start. Did you guys get a chance to? Look at that one?
I think it's interesting. I have a lot of people kind of asking me about this too, like just friends and family and other peers, and I think kind of when this thing kind of got started, it was hey, more of a physical war, but in the back of my head, I always knew this could kind of definitely change, and we've seen. I think both sides of this, right? Kind of pushing back and asking for help. And we've seen some, kind of anti-Russia, if you will, from Ukraine, Ukraine side of things, and, hacking the infrastructure type of a thing. And, the U.S. being always such a hot target, with critical infrastructure, whether it's water supply, power grids, we've seen it before. So we're definitely kind of telling at least our customers, like, hey, be mindful, be alert, ensure you're doing all these things that you should be doing, and just kind of cross your T's, dot your I's, and be really aware to what's happening right now in the world, because things could change very quickly on the cyber side, right?
Yeah.
I was listening to a reporter last night, and they said this means really do the basics that you're supposed to already do.
Yeah.
And it's reality, right? A lot of people just put it off because, we got some other major business initiatives over here, over there. When it hits, it's too late. You can't go back, right?
Yeah.
And so we've seen several customers hit recently, and it's tough watching all that. And the amount of business that they could lose through that, a lot of people, we'll just recover. And sometimes you won't, because customers will move on to the next thing, and they won't be back, right? Mm-hmm. So it's definitely interesting times.
Yeah, and they were saying a lot of the reason for it is, I guess, kind of logically as a retaliation for the sanctions that we placed on them. So I guess it's their way of kind of putting some pressure back on us. At the same time, I know that there's been a lot of reports that a lot of the targets, or the suspected targets, which they're identifying through certain scans or probes that they're detecting against these specific infrastructure. Apparently that they're seeing a lot of these have known vulnerabilities with known patches available, but they're just simply not applied. So it's a little scary to see that even in these, pretty heightened global geopolitical tensions, that there's still not that much, I guess, urgency to patch some of the most basic types of vulnerabilities. And then that's leaving not just these individual organizations at risk, but, all of us as a whole at risk, because, at the end of the day, these critical infrastructures, although often privately run, have huge impacts in the public. We saw that with, with the hacks in 2020 and 2021, like Colonial Pipeline, right? So, very, very terrifying stuff.
Well, I mean, look at Russia, what they're doing in Ukraine. They don't care if it's a hospital, an apartment building, or whatever. So do they care if it's the government when they're attacking the U.S.? No. It can be private enterprise, and they don't really care.
Right.
At the end of the day,
on our soil type of a thing.
They're hurting the U.S. by doing that.
Correct.
Exactly.
Right.
And so to your point, I mean, that's Ann Neuberger says that the most troubling piece overall is the fact that there are the known vulnerabilities have patches available, but people just aren't applying them.
Right.
So that is a very true point.
So you talk about basics. It's like we're not even doing, step one of the basics, right? Which is,
I think we have that problem, or kind of a recurring theme we talk about, right? It's always these things like, that whole defense in depth, even just, knowing what you have in your inventory, patching, can you retire software? Like there's a lot of like little things that can make huge impacts. Like you don't always need the, complicated and complex solutions don't always make the best bang for your buck, right? So even just like you're saying are there like 5 things that we can do that are, tried and true basics that are going to protect you 80%? Yeah, probably, right? And that can carry you a long way. So, I think the private sector too, in some industries that, at least from what I'm seeing and talking to people, a lot are kind of more heightened, which is great. And they are kind of taking things a little bit more serious right now, preventively before something, major could happen. So at least we're seeing the private sector at least kind of, stepping up. And I think we all know on the government side, things can kind of move slower to the regulations and things like that. But, we all need to have that sense of urgency and, take this stuff pretty seriously because it's a matter of time before something could potentially happen. Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because you see when like the larger kind of vulnerabilities make media headlines and make their rounds, like Log4j, right?
Sure.
That was huge, and you'll see these companies scramble to fix these things because I guess there's either a CISO warning or they're seeing it on the news cycle. But then like those same people have critical vulnerabilities from like 2004 that they're just for whatever reason not addressing because this seems
they pretend they don't exist almost.
Right, and they're just focused on the hottest, newest 0 day, and that logic is almost backwards because you would think like hackers aren't necessarily going for the shiniest, newest vulnerability.
They could care less.
Yeah, they're just going for the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest path to entry. So, I think that philosophy is still prevalent in a lot of like legacy infrastructures and organizations. So, getting past that is I think a huge step because eventually one day we should get to a point where most of our perimeter environments for our critical infrastructures is well tightened, right? Perimeter infrastructures are usually a lot smaller to maintain than internal. Sure. So at the very least, if we can get the attack surface down to the human element, we can do ourselves a lot of good there. But one of the interesting things from that article was Biden stating that if they do decide to pursue an attack, that we're prepared to retaliate or respond in some way. So what that response is very curious to me, if that just means another cyber attack, more sanctions, or even some kind of physical retaliation. So
I can tell you, if I'm a private company, I don't want to find out what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You don't want to be waiting around for that to happen, right? So
No. And
Yeah.
not all of this is a technology problem to solve either. I think that's important for a lot of people to know. I mean, you think about, throw it out there, business email compromise, right? If you have policies and procedures established beforehand, then you can catch this stuff before it even occurs. Or even look at your perimeter, to your point earlier, Sammy, where do you really need to have all those services publicly facing? Maybe they should be behind a VPN. And then your perimeter's easier to deal with. If you don't know how to run a website, why are you running it on premise? Outsource it to a hosting provider that their job is to patch and maintain it.
Yep.
So there's some easy steps that don't really cost a lot of money that you can put in place to protect yourself.
Yeah, and this is also a good time for those of you out there that have an IR plan, dust it off, make sure it's still relevant, look through it, actually run through it. It's a great time to do a tabletop exercise for those of you that haven't done one in a while, just to kind of keep things top of mind awareness and what to do if something were to happen. And those little things can make huge impacts that aren't really technical. It's just understanding the motion and the process and things like that. So those are also good ones.
Yeah, call that insurance line, make sure it actually works. Somebody answers on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, you guys were talking about it I think on the last podcast. It's wild to see that most of the costs from these breaches actually come from the administrative parts of dealing with the breach, not even the ransom itself. So to your point, Derek, I think like if the more you actually test your IR plans and test your backups, the more efficient you become when that time actually comes. That you
the
have
more
to
confident too. You're like, well, you know what, this happened. Hey, we've at least practiced it in simulation, but you at least have done more than probably most companies out there, in my opinion.
100%. And then you can set reasonable expectations with your partners and stakeholders. Because like you were mentioning on the last podcast, imagine if you didn't know that the decryption time to get all your data back actually takes a significant amount of time. It's not just like you plug the key in and it's all decrypted. So
you pay them $1 million and you think it's all going to come right back.
Right.
Up.
It's going to take a minute.
And you just communicated to all your stakeholders that, we were going to pay the ransom, we'll be back up whenever. But then the reality is it's going to take you maybe 3-4 days a week. So that's all stuff like to your point, you need to be testing, especially if you have unpatched systems on your perimeter environment. So
yeah. And I think too, with the whole kind of work from home, it's really shifted, what kind of networks look like, and the whole perimeter has really kind of blended and blurred and somewhat disappeared. And that just means that the basics around like identity patching, like what to do in those scenarios are just that much more important and critical and key, right? So
yeah, I would love to see the rate of email-based attacks pre-COVID and pre the war versus now. Right. I mean, I can only imagine how much
2 to 3x probably.
Yeah. Right. Because I mean, before you had like all the physical attack vectors that you could attempt, but now they're if you try and crack somebody's Wi-Fi WPA2 password, it's like there's nobody available on site to capture it from. Right. So you really do have to think about like starting to target the perimeter systems and the individual users. And I think like the game is evolving, and so now so much is about like evading like gateway controls and endpoint, because ultimately at the end of the day, that's like the one area it's hard to do zero trust on email, because then you're not going to get any business, right? So yeah,
logs, right?
And more logs.
Say. Yeah.
Well, and if you have like an existing Office 365 tenant, for example, all that user logon data is not enabled by default. So the newer tenants, when you go to set it up, they've changed all those settings, but that's an area, as an example, to go turn on.
Right.
So you can monitor when somebody's not supposed to be logging in.
Right.
Yeah. Again, all the basics. And I think the other thing that makes it tough is we all know there's a pretty big shortage in cybersecurity professionals. So people are already kind of short-staffed. You're running like their hair on fire as it is. And now we're saying, hey, go do these, multiple more things. But it is important, right? So it's just a matter of prioritization and, working with partners and other companies and vendors that, maybe have, people power that can help with these things. But it's not something you can just put your head in the sand and hope it doesn't happen to you, because industry doesn't matter, vertical, size, it doesn't matter anymore, honestly. So.
Yeah. And that's such a good point. I think it's like for like, every one system you install or every one service you spin up, it feels like there are 5 security tasks that come along with it, right?
Yeah.
Like 5 different controls you need to, or more, right? Like that you need to implement for every one thing that you implement on the IT side. So you're right. A lot of it just has to do with the demand and the lack thereof of supply. Of proficient experts, cybersecurity experts, and that's a big part of the gap. But I think making every IT professional a cybersecurity professional helps, right? If everybody has that mindset, then of course if the vendors start to have that mindset and come with the correct controls pre-configured, it puts less burden on the actual end user to have to go through and have the expertise to configure these things properly, right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
And we've seen some out there. SurveyMonkey was giving credits back if you enabled MFA. Salesforce is enforcing it for all their enterprise customers. So we're starting to see a shift in the tide, because it gets like some 80% plus of attacks all come in through that.
Yeah.
So it's huge to just put on the MFA alone.
It's a big waving target, right?
Yeah.
So you want to shrink that target as much as possible.
It's a great idea too to incentivize it, right? You make cybersecurity fun or have some kind of ROI, then people will do it.
Maybe your bank will say, hey, we'll give you an extra 0.001% interest rate if you enable MFA or something.
Right.
0.002, and I think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No
fraction of a Bitcoin or something.
Well, yeah, it's the car insurance, they have like good driver rewards, like why not good cybersecurity hygiene rewards, right? It certainly provides some kind of incentive that way.
Gamify it, right?
Right, yeah.
A past job I had gamified healthcare.
Yeah.
So the more steps you took, you would get a Visa card every quarter.
Yeah.
You'd get I think it's $50 or $100. I mean, it's enough to sway you to want to go do something.
The question is, how many people try to game the system?
Yeah. Well, I guess if you had access to the backend database,
put it like on your dog, you know, your little Fitbit, like on your dog.
Oh no, it was in the terms of service. You can't put it on the ceiling fan.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Or put it on your pet as a pet tracker.
Like
they actually wrote that in the terms
That's smart,
of service.
because they know people are going to find a loophole.
Yeah,
I know people that would try to be like game the system. So
right. Yeah.
Me.
No, it's true. It's true.
Oh man.
But hey, I mean, if you're gonna game the system by being like, we enabled MFA on everything, like,
yeah, you got me.
You got us.
Yeah, that's a good one to have.
Yeah.
So kind of tying into this too, we'll keep keeping our theme here. Some interesting news came out of a couple of open source tools that kind of turned deadly.
Yeah.
Wicked is a word. I don't know what word you want to use there, but
a little bit of vigilanteism.
A little bit of a whatever kind of terminology you want to call it, vigilante-ware or something like that, where it was very political on the messaging, and then was turning into, well, if you're coming out of one of these countries, we're going to do bad things with this software. So that kind of raises a lot of questions on the open source community now, and what that looks like. So, yeah,
a lot of ethics coming into question here.
Well, it's always been a concern of mine with open source that malicious code could always be inserted, and you never know.
Yeah.
You pull it from the current branch, you go deploy it, and nobody vetted it. It's just a big issue. I know originally, like, you take the reverse of this. If you had the Russian language pack installed, certain malware or ransomware wouldn't detonate or go off. So it's kind of ironic how this is flipping that.
Yeah, now it's the other way.
Oh, well,
if you are from this area,
if you are there, we're going to go after and delete your drives.
Yeah. I see what the intent was. The problem is with that philosophy is there are a lot of unintended victims as a result of that.
Yeah, it was like, it's kind of using like what's that saying? Like using dynamite to catch a fish or something.
Right.
It's a huge blast radius for something that was very like, I want to get my point across.
Right.
So it kind of hurts, I think, the bigger community as a whole as to what this whole thing.
Well, then the reputation of that developer too, because it's just like you were willing to kind of compromise your typical, operating procedures and ethics. I'm not so sure, but it just depends what side of the fence you're on. But he was willing to do that, which also brings up the question in the future, like, what other things is this person politically motivated by? Right. And what will they do as having that much influence over the code base? What will they do with that influence? So while it may, to some parties, seem kind of innocuous, or not innocuous, but trivial, it's more about like imagine if Google started doing stuff like that. You wouldn't really know what to feel about Google. That kind of vigilante type behavior. It shows they're willing to go above the law to make their point. Is the main
like who
issue.
puts them in control, or who says you can do this?
Judge, jury, and executioner.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Hey, but they used heart emojis. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
And you can already tell what kind of mindset it is, right? It's like a kind of trolly hacker type person, even though they may not be specifically an InfoSec. What they did was 100% falls into that category of a threat actor that was targeted at.
It's disruptive. It's destructive.
It's
and
supply chain attack. Yeah,
it's 100% made to just cause havoc. Like, there's no ransom. It's just destroy.
Yep.
So
and then quite targeted. Belarus was an interesting addition to that. I'm not as versed as say our politicians on this, but I didn't realize that there was such involvement on that end. But to that point, though, it's just incredible to see the response. The problem, as well as what you don't want, is unintended consequences to like the country of Ukraine, because obviously they were targeting Russia for their own political ideals, but there are certain companies from Ukraine that rely on some of the let's just say some of the vendors, some of the businesses, some of the programmers and developers in Russia. Yeah. And if their systems go offline, it actually impacts the systems of people in Ukraine. So I think there was a lot of unintended consequences that came out of it. And then hopefully this doesn't put a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Western companies when it comes to using open source packages. at the end of the day, you should have a QA process for implementing these things anyways for new patches. We learned that after SolarWinds.
Yeah.
But still, it doesn't it doesn't help the industry very much.
Yeah, it doesn't really bode well for the overall trust. And then to your point, like, a lot of people use these packages in like other software too, right? So like you have a lot of innocent potential bystanders that were like, hey, I'm using this part of the code for my own thing, and now I look bad because this thing is part of this other, bigger issue. So it's just, it's just not a good approach to getting your message across politically, right?
Exactly.
So. Yeah, there's probably a certain, group of people that were pretty excited about that, but I think for like the buttoned up kind of white collar world, this was more of just seen as kind of like vigilanteism, which again is, it's not uncommon in the world of cybersecurity, but certainly not like what we want to get comfortable with as a society.
Yeah, I think because of everything that's happening right now, we're kind of entering like uncharted territory of like what's real, from like a true cyber warfare perspective. We never really had this before. It's now become very public. It's top of mind. People are asking about it. I mean, we're talking about it, and we're kind of just seeing it unfold as to like what's possible and like what to expect next time, right? Because I mean, we all know that there's things that are going to happen. So
yeah, it's very true because and before this, it was generally speaking, quote unquote, peacetime. So a lot of the politically motivated or destructive attacks were all theoretical. You didn't really see them live that much. But now we're really actually starting to see like the weaponization of these things and them being used for these destructive intent.
Yeah.
And it's like a way different scene than just ransomware or just trying to milk people for money or organizations.
Yeah,
for
for
money.
right now, like this is not about the money at all.
No.
This is about like your message, your stance, your ideals, your beliefs, all that stuff, no matter which side you're on. But yeah, now we're seeing the weaponization of cyber technology and information technology. So
yeah, and it may be like the most profound display of that in probably history. I think beforehand it was you probably had it in a more covert, clandestine type way, but now it's just like
it's just top of mind.
Right,
and it's on like the news, and I mean, the fact the White House is coming out and saying this is like, whoa, like that's a pretty serious statement for them to make, right? Like, hey, heads up.
Well, and then this guy didn't even hide it. He put banners saying like,
yeah,
I did
like
this.
He's proud of this. Like,
he wants the credit.
Yeah, 100%.
He got his 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah, and in certain worlds, they'll really idolize this person. He'll probably have like certain job opportunities that you wouldn't get had he not done that. But it just, it's crazy.
Yeah. I think maybe the last one we can kind of wrap up with is there's been a few more, let's just call them high profile targets of some breaches. A couple of threat actors making the rounds right now. Some big names out there, NVIDIA, Samsung, Microsoft, and a couple others. It's just we're seeing, again, that kind of continued trend. These don't appear to be kind of quote unquote ransomware type attacks and things like that. It's more about the data and almost like a proof of, hey, like we're able to get in and things like that. So it just also kind of reiterates that no matter the size of the target, if someone's really going to target you, there's a lot of ways that they're going to, work their skill and work their magic, if you will. And having these things are very important. So,
well, what it tells me is they don't have good data leakage protection in place because they couldn't detect in the first place that anything left their environment. So I think it's an eye opener to get the word out with everybody in cybersecurity that that's critical. It's that insider threat type of behavior and being able to look for that, filter it, block it, alert on it, have somebody check on it. I mean, I know these systems create a lot of false positives.
Yeah.
But look where we're at today. You don't have the data to know if I was really breached or not. So I get that there's two sides of that too, because it is a lot of data to keep to go back and detect all of that. But on the flip side, you don't have to keep retention for a long time. 30, 90 days can give you a lot of data that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think this group in question too, like, they're kind of notorious for like straight up asking for people that work at these companies. Like, hey, can you install a VPN for me or, install this software or whatever. So they're just kind of blatantly obvious, like trying to work the insider as opposed to, I don't want to say like take away from it and like work their way into it, but trying to find a easy approach to just getting on the network, so to speak, and just poking around. And then to your point, it makes it very hard to detect the anomalies, because like they're not taking a traditional door. It's almost like someone opened the door for them, let them in, and then like they walk out with your TV, versus like trying to break into your door then take your TV, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
but the fact that some of these people have access to that much data, that's also concerning.
Oh, for sure.
Why do I need access to all of that source code? Do I work on all those branches? Do I work on the whole thing?
Especially at these large, enterprises that should have really defined, least principle of privilege, right? And, roles and responsibilities of who does what. And not everyone needs to be the super admin,
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good way to say it.
Zero trust comes in. And that's why you tend to, nowadays it's funny when I do assessments, I tend to see like organizations that kind of started within the past 5 years tend to have way better security than the people of before. And maybe that's logical, but it just shows that a lot of the issue just comes from like legacy infrastructure not coming out of the box with the correct controls. Whereas nowadays it's so much easier to do zero trust first, because a lot of the platforms are built that way. You can't, they don't say allow all, it's allow nothing. And then you have to go type in what's allowed. You have to go type,
it's the opposite.
Exactly. And so I just feel with a lot of the legacy infrastructure, a lot of these organizations, it's about kind of either migrating or taking the time to basically destroy the old and establish the new. And it's tough to do that while maintaining business continuity, right? That's the main issue, is like the effect on operations. But I mean, ultimately, like you're saying, I think they're going to keep going after these large organizations, because they don't. If they're politically motivated and the goal is just to weaken the U.S., you don't necessarily need to go after the biggest targets or the most critical infrastructure. You can go after widespread enterprise and then start to really do damage across different industries, which adds pressure in a different way. So yeah, I mean, it's at least if you're gonna implement zero trust, at least start externally first from the perimeter, right? Whitelist. Make sure you're using Bastion hosts. Limit the amount of services that are available, the hosts that are even live, and then go from there. The perimeter environment's a lot smaller than the internal environment, so it's a lot easier to implement at that scale than it is, with 10,000 hosts or whatnot. So,
yeah, and I do think a lot of people too that have like these large companies where they have different divisions and business units, and like really more importantly, like subcontractors and third parties working on their networks or in their networks. I think that's a pretty big gap that most people don't look into, and they kind of almost trust the vendor to do the right thing on the back end, and we've seen that's not the right case. So, now's a good time to kind of, again, when you dust out that IR policy, what's your third party and kind of vendor policy look like, and how do you allow access, and should you allow access, or should you allow a real lockdown jump box that says, hey, no, I control the security now and you have access, not just letting anybody on and things like that. So
that's where SASE really comes in nowadays.
Yeah,
I remember a vendor, I don't know, 5 jobs ago now, where we had it locked down on the Cisco ASA firewall VPN that they could only access one machine.
Right.
But that's okay. They get on that machine and then they have access to everything else.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point, right? Like, I get it. We're blocking a lot of the other traffic that could be coming through and touching other servers, etc. So, I mean, it is something.
Yeah.
But it just always blew my mind. It's like, you got to look beyond just what your entry point is for them, because they could use that Bastion host, etc., to get further into the environment. So, same type of model.
Yeah. So I guess kind of wrapping up, I don't know, give us, Brian, like a closing thought, our friends out there can do to help stay safe right now.
Well, the biggest one I would check on is my backups. Have you done recovery, tested that they actually work? Yeah. Right? That's the biggest thing that I think I take away from a takeaway from the White House stuff that's come out, that a lot of people don't really test that stuff. They just think it's there, but actually go and validate that you can recover stuff back.
Okay. How about you, Sammy?
Yeah, I mean, mine will probably be a little more obvious, but just make sure you're patching, particularly on your perimeter environment. Right now, a lot of the threats are coming externally, and from social engineering and phishing attacks. So continuing to do user education and training. I think those two pieces alone can mitigate probably like 80% of the risk that we're experiencing right now.
Nice.
And then when you combine it with what Brian said, you put yourself in a good position in the event if something happens like this. Yeah.
Cool. And I'll close out with, more of these cyber leaders out there. Again, dust off that IR plan, go through it, review it with kind of, your key personnel, and just make sure you have something in place and plan for something, because you never know.
Yeah.
So.
And expand it outside of IT.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Make sure HR, legal, the
That's a good point.
marketing firms, et cetera, whatever is all part of it.
Yeah, include the actual business, not just IT, for sure, because everyone's going to be involved in a recovery scenario. We've seen it time and time again. So
exactly.
Cool. All right. Take care. Bye bye.
Like,
Thanks for joining.
Subscribe.
Sweet.